When you look at all the lists of best flies, you often see a lot of crossover. It feels like everybody thinks that the same group of 2 or 3 dozen flies are the best. But have you ever wondered why that is? Are these flies really that good, or are we just being lazy and copying lists from each other? Well, in my experience as a guide and angler of over 20 years, the best flies are the ones that are rooted in reality. They imitate, they mimic the bugs, the aquatic insects that make up a majority of a fish's diet. But how do you know what a certain pattern is trying to imitate? Shouldn't it just be enough to know, okay, here are the best flies, use these ones? On today's episode of Untangled, I'm going to explain why all that matters, how it can help you catch more fish, and the flies that you do not want to go to the river without. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Co. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled, and I am your host, Spencer Durrant, back at it for yet another week of podcasting excellence. Now, I mentioned a list of flies that we're going to talk about, flies you don't want to go to the river without. There's 15 of them, and I'm going to get to that list. But before we do, I want to address a little bit of what I discussed to open the show, and specifically the why question that I posed to you. Why does it matter to know what your fake bugs, what the flies in your fly box, why does it matter to know what those imitate? What does that actually do for you as an angler? How does that help you improve and level up? Now, if you're new here at VFC, you're going to quickly learn that explaining the why, that's our thing. That's what we do here at VFC. Understanding the why behind all the different things we do in fly fishing is the best way to level up and become a great angler. So I'm going to get into that. I want to set the stage for y'all a little bit with a story as I explain this why concept. Earlier this year, I got into bread making, and my interest in it is authentic because I did not get into it during the pandemic. Okay. I wasn't just bored. I love bread. I actually enjoy baking. I've always kind of liked it. So it's been fun, just kind of a natural thing for me to do and learn. But my first loaves of bread were rough. They were more like bricks than bread. Okay, I could have built a house out of these things. The University of Utah men's basketball team, they saw these loaves and thought they were the bricks that they're throwing up every night on the court. They were so bad. They were dense. They were chewy. They weren't fluffy. It was bad. And I was getting pretty frustrated. I wondered if this whole bread baking thing was for me. And then I thought, well, everybody else can do it. I should be able to figure it out, right? Well, the problem is I was just following a recipe, just following some steps. I didn't understand any of the why behind bread making. Why does kneading the dough matter? Why does the temperature of your water matter? Why does using milk instead of water result in fluffier bread? Why do all of these things matter? Because I was looking through, I hopped on Reddit asking for help. Why does my bread suck? And everybody starts talking about, well, milk temperature and all this stuff. And I'm thinking, no, that's dumb. That doesn't matter. Okay, well, it actually does. Because I spent a few weeks and like a half dozen loaves of bread that we couldn't even really eat, wasted a whole bunch of flour before I cracked the code and really figured it out. Now I'm consistently getting a great loaf of bread every time. I don't have to go to the store to buy bread anymore. It's great. But that only happened because I understand what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. We're going to take that same concept into understanding flies, because once you understand this why behind things, that's what makes you go from just laying bricks when you're out there on the river to consistently catching fish and having a great time, feeling like you can do this, that you can go out there on your own and be successful. That's the idea of the self-sufficient angler that we talk about here at VFC, where you're able to go out there, do things on your own, and have success. That's where we want to help you get to. And you don't get there if I just say, well, here's 15 flies, go fish them. You're never going to get there if that's the extent of your learning and your knowledge. You've got to dig deep on this stuff. So let's take a minute and go over the different aquatic insects that all our flies are going to imitate. There are 5 major groups of aquatic insects. We've got our Caddis, our Midges, our Mayflies, our Stoneflies, And then we've got scuds, sow-bugs, and worms. And those aren't technically aquatic insects, but we're going to throw them in here just because they get grouped in with all the other food that fish eat on a regular basis. Now, the overwhelming majority of flies that are tied that you buy from us here at VFC or that you tie yourself, they are designed to imitate one of those. Some kind of caddis, midge, mayfly, stonefly, scud, sowbug, or a worm. There are terrestrial insects as well, like grasshoppers and cicadas, but I'm talking just about the aquatic insects. So the flies in your fly box are going to imitate one of those aquatic insects that I just mentioned, but it's not enough to just know, oh, well, this might be a caddis fly. Let's talk about some of their characteristics. Let's dive into them a little bit so you actually have some knowledge to apply here. And I've found, at least in my experience, that beginners, folks who just don't know a whole lot about aquatic insects, usually have the hardest time telling the nymphs apart, the underwater version of these bugs as far as what they imitate, because there's a lot of crossover in how some of these nymphs appear. It's a lot like babies. They all look the same. So we're going to focus a little bit more on the nymphs than the dries. The dries are a lot easier to tell apart once you know just a few of the basics. So we'll start out with stoneflies. Stoneflies, they're the biggest of the aquatic insects. They get pretty big. So your bigger nymphs are often going to be tied to imitate these bugs. They've got heavily segmented bodies, very distinct sections on their bodies. They've got two tails and then six legs, not six pairs of legs, three pairs of legs. Just about every stonefly nymph will be tied with something to represent the two tails and the six legs they have. Some stonefly nymphs will take different ways to imitate the thorax or the wing cases and whatnot, but they're all going to have something to imitate their tails and their legs. Those are the big defining characteristics. Now, as adults, they're long, they still have six legs, and they are the biggest bugs that you're going to see out on the water, except for maybe a grasshopper. And stoneflies are going to be most active in early summer from about, sometimes even late spring. So from about May to, mid-July or so. It will depend based on where you're at, but that's a general trend for it. Midges will go to the opposite end of the spectrum because they're the smallest. Midges are tiny, and their nymphs are tied to look just like little worms, because midge nymphs do in the water when you see them swimming around. They look like just little itty-bitty worms down there. They come in tons of different colors, so all the patterns that we use to imitate midges are going to come in tons of colors as well. Red, black, green, and brown tend to be the most popular colors. That's what I use. I know a lot of folks fish purple and white midges, though, and do very well with them. As adults, midges are really easy to spot because they look like tiny mosquitoes, so you get really nervous for a minute because you think, oh, crap, I'm getting eaten alive. But midges don't bite. They're the best. I love them because they don't really land on you and they don't bite you. They're just a fantastic bug. They're also active year-round, so the fish can eat these year-round. They're present all year long. Mayflies, our next group, they're a medium-sized insect. They're not too big, they're not too small. They're the Goldilocks. They're just right. Some mayfly species, though, like drakes, they can get pretty big, but most mayfly nymphs are about a size 18 to a size 14. If you've got your fly hooks handy, you can use that as a comparison. They'll have dark segmented bodies, heavily segmented bodies, very similar to what you see with a stonefly nymph, but they are much, much smaller. They'll also have 2 to 3 tails and then short, stubby legs. Stonefly legs are a little bit longer. Mayfly legs are shorter and stubbier. A lot of your classic nymphs, like a pheasant tail and a hare's ear, they primarily represent mayfly nymphs. So that's that same basic size and shape that you see on a pheasant tail. That's what a mayfly nymph is going to look like in the water. As adults, mayflies are very, very easy to spot because they've got these long, beautiful, slender bodies, fine tails, and then these tall, upright wings that almost look like sails on a sailboat when they're sitting on the water. Real pretty looking bug. They sort of glide through the air. They're very graceful. They're kind of fascinating to watch as they move through the air. It doesn't even look like they're really trying. They just fly through the air all happy like. They're very active early spring to midsummer, They kind of taper off a little bit in the heat of the summer, and then they'll get active again in the fall right before winter hits. That's when you could expect to see your mayflies out. Now, caddis flies, they are very similar in size to mayflies, but as a nymph, they're going to have a little bit more of a worm-like appearance sometimes, and they can also have some bright green coloring to them, which you just don't see with the mayfly nymphs. So that's one of your dead giveaways that you've got a caddis nymph because it's longer, it's worm-like, it's still skinny and small, but then it'll have that bright green color with it as well. Frenchies, pheasant tails, hare's ears, they're all designed to imitate caddis nymphs as well. There's a lot, I mentioned this earlier, there's a lot of crossover between how these nymphs appear in the water, especially as nymphs. So it's important to know you can use more than one fly pattern to imitate a couple of different bugs. As adults, they bumble through the air. They bounce around a lot. They don't look like they're very graceful flyers. They just kind of bounce. They do look happy. I'll give them that. They look like they're having a good time. Their wings are pretty long, and when they're not flying through the air, they're tucked against their back, almost like a tent. And then you will have caddis most active from midsummer all the way through early fall. They'll start coming off usually around June in my neck of the woods, and then they'll go all the way until usually the first big frost of the year will knock the caddis out completely. Now, scuds, sow-bugs, and worms, I mentioned them earlier. They're not really insects, but they're super easy to identify. These don't hatch. They don't have an adult version that flies through the air. They stay underwater for their whole lives. Just about every scud pattern that I've ever found is like a size 12 to a 20. They can range in size pretty well, but they all have this curved, segmented body with a hard shell back. They're supposed to look almost like mini shrimp because that's honestly essentially what they are. They're basically just tiny little shrimp. So that's how you tell your scuds, your sow bugs apart from each other. And then worms, hopefully those are really easy to spot. I think we all know what a worm looks like. And then these are available again year round to the fish. So midges, scuds, sow bugs, and worms, you can fish those year round because the fish will key in on them year round when they're around. So I know that's a lot of info. And I know I kind of rushed through it a little bit, but don't worry. You don't have to commit this all to memory because we actually have an ebook that contains all this information. So you can refer to it all when needed. You can just download it on your phone. I'll throw a link to that in the show notes for y'all if you want to grab it. It is free. So just take a look at it. So you've got all this information handy. Okay. Now, again, we went through this information for a reason. I want to remind y'all of that. Remind you of the bread analogy from earlier. When you understand the why behind why you're picking a fly and what that fly is supposed to do, that's when you are going to see your success just skyrocket as an angler. You've got an easier time of matching the hatch, of picking the right fly in any situation if you understand what your flies are supposed to imitate. Learning this why is powerful. I can't overstate enough how much this will dramatically improve your fishing. This is what takes you from just, I'm okay at it to, I'm good. I can go out on the river and have a good day. That's the difference, is understanding the why. All right. Now let's get to the part that y'all have probably been waiting for the longest. The list of the 15 flies that I do not leave the house without. And then I'll tell you what these flies imitate as well, just so you can have yet another reinforcement of, okay, this is what this imitates. Starting off, and before I get into it, there's 15, like I mentioned. I didn't go out and look at anybody else's list when I put this together. I didn't look to see what other folks have on there. I didn't even ask Alex what his would be. I opened up my fly box and looked and said, all right, these are the 15. These are the ones. This is the cutoff. These are the flies I use all the time. This is what works for me in the Rocky Mountains. But it should work just about anywhere you find trout swimming around. So let's get into it. Okay. First one is the elk hair caddis. As its name implies, it's imitating a caddis fly, but it imitates the adult caddis. So that's what this is here for. Our next one is going to be the parachute Adams, one of the oldest flies out there, but kind of like me. It's an oldie, but it's a goodie, dadgummit. The parachute atoms, they're usually used to imitate mayflies, but they can imitate a wide variety of bugs as well. I've used them in different hatches before and had success with them. I just never go anywhere without a parachute atom. So they're just such a versatile bug. I have them in a whole bunch of sizes. I can't talk these up enough. Next up is going to be the parachute green drake. Now, I included the green drake because drakes are an important part of the mayfly life cycle, especially out here where I'm living and fishing. Drakes may not be as widespread as some of the other mayfly species, like your blue winged olives or your pale morning duns. But for me, they're very important, and it's nice to have a bigger mayfly sitting around as well because it works very well as the top fly in a dry dropper rig. It can hold up a lot of bigger nymphs when you need to fish those bigger nymphs. And I like having the green drakes around because if the fish are wanting a more natural looking fly than maybe something made out of foam, it's nice to have that as that top fly in the dry dropper. Now, speaking of foam, our next one's the chubby Chernobyl. This is the goat, the greatest of all time for those who aren't up to date on the lingo of the youths. This is the best hopper imitation. There's a lot of them out there. I've fished a lot of them, and I just keep going back to the chubby. It's just so good. It works well to imitate hoppers, obviously, but then it can do some pinch hitting as a large stonefly adult. And if you need a good fly for the top fly in a hopper dropper rig, it is hard to beat with the chubby Chernobyl hoppers. It's unsinkable. I love this fly. Our next one's going to be the Sparkle Dun. This honestly might be my favorite fly of all time. It's just so good. It's so simple, so easy to tie. That's my favorite thing about it. The Sparkle Dun just imitates an emerging mayfly. Now, I kind of glossed over the life cycles a little bit. Um, Mayflies go through this period of their life cycle where before they become an adult, they're a nymph, and then they turn into adult. They have another stage called an emerger where they're transitioning between the adult or the nymph and the adult, pardon me. And that's what the sparkle then imitates is that particular life cycle stage. And the fish can key in on those when there's a big mayfly hatch going on. So it's great to have a sparkle done kicking around for that. And then in that same vein, my next fly is the last chance cripple as well. This imitates crippled mayflies, and that's just exactly what it sounds like. These are adult mayflies that, for whatever reason, couldn't get off the water and fly away to mate and to make more bugs for us. Maybe their wings broken or they couldn't get out of their nymphal shuck all the way. The last chance cripple imitates that. And there's a lot of times when I'm fishing a mayfly hatch and I can throw a cripple out there and the fish will go for that instead of the adult. Almost 9-1 sometimes because that cripple, they see that as a bug that's less likely to escape, that's an easier target for them. So the fish are going to key in on that crippled mayfly before they look for all the other stuff. So they're great to have around, and the last chance cripple can work for just about any mayfly hatch. Just tie it in different colors for what you need. Our next up is going to be the zebra midge. If you've only got one midge nymph, it better be the zebra midge. This has got a great case for the greatest fly of all time. I think that there's no denying that. It works everywhere. Some of my biggest fish have come on a zebra midge. I love them. Our next one's going to be the Frenchie. I like the Frenchies more than the pheasant tails. They're essentially the same fly, and they're meant to imitate Caddis or Mayfly nymphs. But I like the Frenchie because it's a little bit easier to tie and it sinks just a little bit better than a pheasant tail. So that's why it gets the edge for me in my boxes. Next up is going to be the Pat's rubber legs. I have a lot of different stonefly nymphs that I use, just depending on what I need. Some of them are tied really heavy. Some of them are very realistic looking. Some of them are more impressionistic. And it really just depends on where I'm fishing, which one I use. But the Pat's rubber legs gets the most use out of all my stonefly nymphs because A, it's super easy to tie. It sinks like a rock. And the fish love them. I have yet to meet a river where the Pats would not produce something. As long as there were stoneflies in the river, Fish were going to eat the pads. I love them. Can't have enough of them. They're fantastic. Our next one is going to be a hare's ear. This is a Mayfly or Caddis imitation. And I mean, the hare's ear is another one of those really old classic flies that just can't get enough of. They're a fantastic little pattern that they just go out there and they get the job done. They're like your favorite basketball player that isn't the superstar. He just goes out there and gets the job done and goes home. That's what the hare's ear is. It's a fantastic little pattern. Next up is going to be our egg bomber. Now, eggs, they're not an aquatic insect. However, eggs can be present in a river for a variety of reasons. Usually it's going to, at a variety of times of the year for a variety of reasons. There's one reason eggs going to be in the river, because they're spawning fish in the river. That's why. So when fish spawn, they're depositing their eggs into their nest, which we call a redd, and not every egg makes it into the redd, and some of them will drift downstream, and the fish that aren't spawning, when they see those eggs going by, that's a super high protein meal, and they're going to snack on those things something fierce. So you want to have some eggs in your box. Your best time to fish eggs is usually going to be from mid-fall through early winter, and then again from late winter through about mid-spring. That's when the biggest spawns are going to happen. That might be different depending on the river that you're fishing and where you live, but that's usually a good time to have some egg flies kicking around. Just make sure that if you are fishing with eggs and you're in a river where the fish are spawning, that you don't fish to the spawning fish and then don't walk through their redds. If you walk through their redds, you can crush all those little eggs and kill the next generation of fish, which is no good. We don't want to do that. So just a friendly reminder for you there. Next up is going to be scuds. There's tons of different scud patterns out there. Any work just fine. I tie a little one that uses a fluorescent pink hotspot and rainbow sow dubbing, I believe, is what I use for that. It's a simple pattern. It works for me really well, but just about anything is going to work. Or Ray Charles is a very popular scud pattern or sow bug pattern, and I would recommend those as well if you need it. Next up is going to be the Jujubatus. This is a relatively recent addition to my collection. Charlie Craven came up with this. It imitates Mayfly nymphs, and it is hyper realistic. They're a pain in the butt to tie. Charlie, I don't know how he even dreamt it up, but I'm glad he did. They're just a pain to tie. I really like them because they're so realistic. They work very well on pressured tailwaters, places that see a ton of anglers, a ton of flies. The Jujubatus is going to do some work for you. It's going to catch some fish. Bars emergers. This is a great emerging Mayfly pattern. That's what they're tied to imitate. So the sparkle dun I mentioned, that it imitates a Mayfly emerger. Well, it imitates Mayfly emergers that are right up in the surface. The bars emerger can imitate something that's right up in the surface or that's working its way up to the surface, so a little bit lower in the water. You can fish it almost like a regular nymph at times. That's why I like having some bars emergers around. It just gives me a little bit more variety in how I can present Mayfly nymphs to the fish. And since Mayflies are such an important part of a fish's diet, it's nice to have different ways to present them. And then last but surely not least, and I have Alex almost exclusively to thank for this, the Prince nymph. I used to not fish princes very much, but in the last, what's it been, year and a half maybe? Yeah, about a year and a half, Alex has been fishing a bunch of princes, and then that's kind of rubbed off on me because he's catching fish, so I keep saying to him, hey, give me some prince nymphs. He says, go tie your own. No, he gives me some prince nymphs. But it's kind of an attractor pattern. It's not tied to necessarily imitate anything in particular, but it does look a lot like a stonefly. I think its size and shape trigger that stonefly recognition in fish, and that's why they go for it. That's just my 2 cents on it, but that's what the prince nymph does, and I can't tell you how much I love fishing a prince. They've come through clutch for me lately, so they're a great fly to have around. So that's my 15. That's the stuff you need to know about the why behind this. Why does it matter? Why do we need to know what our bugs are imitating? Well, hopefully we got that message there to you. And if there's anything in this part of the show that you have questions about at all, please let me know. I'd love to explain anything in more detail if I need to. And with that, folks, we are going to move on to the Q&A section of this week's show.
Nothing is worse than hooking into a big fish only to have your knot break halfway through the fight. Setting up your rod and tying knots can be confusing and frustrating, especially if you're unsure if it's going to work. That's why we put together our Rigs and Knots Pocket Guide. It has instructions and tips on how to set up the most time-tested, proven, reliable fly fishing rigs step by step. So if you want to spend less time tinkering and more time fishing with confidence, click or tap the link in the show notes to get this guide for free. All right, back to the show.
Every week here at Untangled, we dedicate half the show to directly answering questions from our listeners and viewers. And often, the questions you all ask are going to be the basis for the opening portion of the show as well. If you've got a question you would like answered, please send them in. We need as many as we can get. There's a link to do that in the show notes. And our first question this week comes to us. Paul from Colorado is going to write in. He says, what kind or style of boxes are best for my dry flies? What do you guys use? I have been using boxes that have a foam insert that the hooks push into. I find that they do not seem tall enough to keep the wings and hackles from being flattened or crushed. I don't like open compartments because flies easily can fall out while I'm getting a fly out of the open compartment. So, Paul, this is a problem. Thanks for the question, first off, but this is a problem I've been trying to solve for a while, actually. I've got ideas of new boxes that should hopefully avoid this. So hopefully those boxes happen at some point in my life, because I run into the same issue all the time. What I've ended up doing for all of my parachute flies, I use boxes with the silicone inserts. And the reason I do that is I feel like they're way better for holding flies. I just use our VFC box for all my parachute flies. I'll throw a link in the show notes if y'all need a new box. But the silicone boxes, when I say silicone boxes, they can be made out of anything, but what actually holds the fly is silicone. It's not foam. And the reason that I go for those is that silicone, it's almost a firm kind of rubber. It doesn't tear. It doesn't lose its shape. It doesn't expand or contract. It just stays the same. And it's got these tight slits cut into it that you slide the hook into, and it holds the fly that way. They don't expand or tear over time the way that foam does. That's why I've gone for those. It's just a much more secure way to hold your flies. And I use that for my parachute flies and then all my nymphs as well. And for my dry flies, though, I do use a compartment box. And that's just been the best. For my regularly hackled dry flies that have hackles standing straight up, I honestly haven't had an issue losing flies out of it, knock on wood, right? I haven't dropped too many from there. I went with the Umpqua Bug Locker, I think they're called. And I haven't dropped, like I said, I haven't dropped too many flies from it. It's about, I don't know, 10 inches long by 4 or 3 inches wide. It's not a very big box, fits my little chest pack. But you pop the lid open and there's 6 or 8 compartments in there. You can move them around, but you just pop the lid open, and when you go to a fly shop, if you look at the compartments that hold the flies in all the bins, it looks just like that, just smaller. That's what when you open this little box, that's what it looks like. Or if you've ordered flies from us here at VFC, it looks just like the boxes that we send our flies out in as well. And I like it because the flies can just sit in those compartments without the hackle getting crushed. It's not as organized. And yes, there is the potential to drop flies or to lose them out of that box, but I haven't had too much of an issue with that. And it's just been the best way to store those hackled dry flies in a way that they don't get crushed. And that's the only solution I've found that I like so far. Alex doesn't use that. He uses, and now I'm blanking on it. I should have written this down in my notes for the show. I think he uses a fish pond box, if I'm not mistaken, for his hackled dry flies, but I could be wrong. It's just another one of those silicone boxes, but it's got a little bit more space on the lid so it doesn't crush as much. I still don't like that as much as the compartment box, though. That's what I go with. It works for me. I say give it a try, Paul, and see if it really is that big of a deal breaker for you. But thanks for sending your question in. I appreciate it. Our next question comes to us, Paul from Idaho. 2 Pauls in a row. I wonder if that's ever happened on the show before. Paul from Idaho writes in and says, my personal preference is to not use split shot when using nymphs. Is it best to tie nymphs with weighted beads or lead wire on the body of the fly? Paul, this is a great question, and that's how I feel as well. I don't like adding split shot to my nymph rigs if I can help it. Split shot is the last resort for me. I like to use heavier flies instead. The reason behind that is the split shot, I think it's a little bit harder to cast. It's not as delicate of a presentation in the water. And then when you put that much weight on your leader and your tippet, when the fish go to eat that nymph as it's underwater, they're going to swallow that, and then there's going to be resistance immediately from all that weight sticking on the leader and the tippet. And I think that weight causes them to spit the fly out a little bit quicker. It tells them almost instantly, hey, this weird resistance that I'm feeling is not real. And they spit it out before you can even feel that they ate it, because the other issue with this is when you put too much split shot on a rig, it does dampen the sensitivity, so you don't feel as much as you do if you just use heavy flies instead and keep the leader and your tippet completely free of any weight. That's why the tight line anglers, the guys who are only using the long 20, 30 foot leaders and almost no fly line, they don't use split shot because you get way more sensitivity if you don't have it on the line. So that's what I do. Alex is firmly in that camp as well. That's, in our experience, the best way to do it. As to your question, though, do I use weighted beads or lead wire on the body of the fly? I use a combination of both. It honestly just depends on what you want that fly to do. If you really want it to just sink like a rock and just get to the bottom, then lead wire around it and tungsten bead on top, and boom, that thing will sink. It will sink good. But a lot of my medium-sized nymphs, like a 14 to an 18, I don't use a whole lot of lead wire on. I just use tungsten beads. And I use tungsten beads on almost all of my flies because tungsten sinks quicker than brass. Sometimes I will tie my nymphs with a brass bead or even a glass bead if I don't want them to sink very far, if I want them to just barely drop below the surface. But most of the time I'm throwing tungsten on there. My smaller nymphs, like a size 20 or under, I almost never use any lead wire on those at all. And then my bigger nymphs, again, I'll use lead wire and tungsten to really get those down. Now, if I had to pick one or the other, I think the tungsten beads help the fly sink more than the lead on its own. It's just my own anecdotal experience. I have no idea if that's legitimate or not. But using them together is a great way to help get your flies down deep. So I don't think of it as an either or, be more than willing to use both. But I appreciate the question, Paul. Thank you so much for sending it in. Darren from California has our next question. Writes in and says, hey, Spencer, this season, I started using a dry dropper after seeing you talk about it multiple times. It has quickly become my favorite rig, especially now that we're in the middle of hopper season. I was recently hiking to a new spot on a river I've fished multiple times with no success, and there were millions of hoppers flying around. I tied on a hopper and finally caught my first fish on that river. I go to this river most weekends, but over the July 4th weekend, I caught at least 50 fish. A lot of those were on the dropper, but it was an incredible couple of days. My question is about the adjustable dry dropper rig. I don't believe I've seen you mention it. Do you ever use it, or do you just retie a dropper different lengths throughout a day for different sections of a river? If you use it, do you think there's a best way to set it up, like a sliding tag end, beads and tubing on the hook of the dry fly, etc.? If you don't use it, is there a reason as to why not, or do you just find yourself not needing it? Thank you again for the amazing content you guys make here. Darren, thanks for the question. Congrats on the great day you had. It sounds like a fantastic time. This is a really interesting question. And I wanted to answer it because I've seen a lot of questions about an adjustable dry dropper rig in our school group. That's an online community we have here at VFC where the best way to describe it is like Facebook, but it doesn't suck. So it's a great place. You can just talk fly fishing with everybody. I'll throw a link to join that in the show notes if you're interested. But what Darren is talking about here is there are a few different ways that you can rig up a dry dropper. You can tie a dry dropper together so that the dropper is actually adjustable. You can change the depth of your dropper without retying the dropper rig itself. So that way you can tweak the depth based on the different river conditions that you encounter throughout the day. I've never used a rig like that, and I'm a little wary of them. I'll be completely honest, because I wonder if they're just getting too complicated or they're just trying to solve for a problem that doesn't really exist. And what I mean by that is I it's very rare when I'm fishing a dry dropper rig that I run into a situation multiple times throughout the day where I think, man, I really should be adjusting this hole to hole. Because when I set up a dry dropper rig, what I do is, unless I'm fishing something that's really shallow, I tend to start out with about 2 feet of tippet for my dropper. Now, sometimes I will fish 2 droppers if I need to get down deeper, and if I'm in a state that allows you to fish 3 flies. Wyoming does, Utah does as well. I can't remember on Colorado, Idaho, Montana. I know in Yellowstone you can only fish two flies, or is it even 1 fly? I can't remember. But yeah, there's different regulations based on where you're at. So always check those. Is the point I'm trying to make. But anyways, but with my first dropper being about 2 feet below the dry fly, that feels like the perfect length for me, because if it proves too long for a certain piece of water, I can either replace the nymph with an unweighted version of that nymph, or I can just trim a few inches off the tippet. And then if I need to lengthen it later, I just tie on another piece of tippet right there. But I like going with that longer dropper right off the bat because it ensures that my flies get down to where they should, even in the faster currents. And then it's a good all-around length for a lot of the streams I fish as well. So if you're on a bigger tailwater or just a deeper stream in general, maybe that 2 foot depth isn't a good place to start out. Maybe you need to start out at 2.5 feet to get down. But you're not always dragging bottom every time with a dry dropper rig anyways. You're usually hitting the top and then the bottom third of the water column with that dry dropper rig. If you got to get all the way down, that's when a nymph rig is going to be more effective for you. So that's also why I don't really worry about changing the depth of it too much, because I'm not targeting the fish that are all the way on the bottom with that dry dropper rig. I'm targeting the fish that are looking up for the dry fly and then that are looking to still eat something in that bottom third of the water column. Because usually when you're fishing dry droppers, the fish are a little bit more active. They're more willing to move to eat that time of the year. So I just don't mess with these rigs because there's a lot of complexity to them and they can be a pain in the butt to set up and to tie. I'm not sure how adding that many more knots and that much more complexity to your leader is actually going to help anything. If anything, I would be worried that all those extra knots are adding potential failure points where I'm going to lose the whole rig. It just seems like a lot more work than it's worth in solving a problem that doesn't really exist. So that's my 2 cents on it. Hopefully that helps. I appreciate the question, Darren. Stephanie from Colorado has got her next question. She writes in and says, love the podcast, recently found it and have been binging it and learning a lot. How often do you change flies or nymphs? Say you go out to the river and either go with a solid set of flies or a hopper dropper rig, like a hopper to a zebra midge, and then the fish aren't biting. I have been working more lately on trying to get it to the right depth in the water column, but how long do you fish a setup before changing? Stephanie, that's a great question. Thanks for sending it in. And the answer is probably not what you're looking for, because it depends. Let me give you an example, okay, to explain what I mean. A couple weeks ago, I was out with Alex. We were fishing here together, and we were filming a little bit in the morning, and then we took a break in the afternoon to fish. and I rigged up with what I thought was going to work for the day. I had an egg on with zebra midge and then a jujubatus underneath it. I was fishing 3 nymphs, and I felt very confident in that rig because there were a lot of spawning fish in the river, so I knew the eggs would be around. We weren't fishing around any reds, but I knew there were spawning fish in the river. And then the zebra midge, I had confidence in because I've always got confidence in the zebra midge. And then there were a bunch of trichos on the water, so I thought that jujubatus might work since it's a good mayfly nymph. And I, I did not get anything for about 2 hours. No bites, no interest, no bumps, nothing. But I also knew that I hadn't got the presentation quite perfect. I didn't have it dialed exactly to where I needed it to because I was trying different depths. I was trying to figure out where the fish were, not just different depths, but also different water types. I didn't know if the fish were still going to be in the really slow stuff, or were they in the moderate stuff, were they in the pools, were they in the seams. I just didn't know where the fish were because I hadn't been to the river for probably a month at that point. It had been a minute since I'd been to that river. So I kept fishing it, and I finally found a run that I said, okay, if there's no fish here and I don't get anything out of it, I will change my flies. But what I did is I finally got those flies to drop into that run the exact way that they needed to at the exact depth. And the first cast that I got those flies to sit where they should, boom, caught a big old beautiful, wonderful little rainbow trout. And that was all just because I made that tiny little switch in presentation. I just had to get my flies to the right spot. I had confidence in those flies. I just had to present them properly. Now that should be your goal before you change your flies, is to get the best presentation you possibly can with your flies, and then do that in a few different spots. Don't just do it in one hole and think, okay, well, they don't like that. There just might not be fish in that hole, or it's entirely possible they just didn't want to eat. We like to think that we can convince fish to eat all the time, but I think, and I'm not kidding around here, I think they just don't sometimes. They're not constantly eating like we maybe think they are. Might not be true, but that's how it feels. So just remember that really, really try to get that rig presented as perfectly as you can in a few different spots before you make any big changes, because 90% of success in fly fishing is coming down to presentation. Your fly choice matters, but presentation matters more. So if you've done what you feel like is the absolute perfect presentation, you've done it in 2 or 3 spots, and you still don't have any interest from the fish at all, that's when I'd start tweaking the rig. I don't know if I would change it completely, but that's when I would start tweaking it. That's what I do with my fishing, and I think that's the best course of action to take. So I appreciate that question, Stephanie. Thanks for sending it in. And with that, folks, we are done with this week's Q&A portion of the show, but just like every week, we've got the Live Real Life moment coming right up. Our goal here at VFC is to help you have a great day on the water and live real life. We want to hear about these times that you have on the water, and that's what the Live Real Life moment is for. It's a chance for you to share the stories that you're experiencing with the entire VFC audience. There's a link to submit your own Live Real Life moments in the show notes. If you want to throw a picture in with it as well, even a video, that would be great. We can share those. And this week's Live Real Life moment is from Dave in California. Dave wrote in and said, I got to spend an amazing couple of days fishing up on the Fall River here in Northern California. Fall River is one of the largest spring-fed rivers in the U.S. It's gorgeous with cold, clear water and the amazing seagrass that you can watch slowly flowing in the water below the boat. It is perfect for aquatic insects with amazing hatches, including the famous Hexagenia mayflies that come out in the evening in June. More on that in a moment. We had a great day fishing and caught, or at least had action with every technique we used: dries, dry droppers, nymphing, and streamers. And we caught fish in every spot we stopped and anchored. There was one moment watching some ranchers and their dogs work cattle next to us while trout were rising to eat trichos, when my guide friend Colin, who took this lovely picture of me, said, "Tell me this doesn't feel like Montana." As soon as he said Montana, a nice big rainbow smashed my dry fly, and it was game on. That night, we returned for the hex hatch. It was amazing and frustrating. I missed my hook sets too early, too late, then nailed it. My friend said, strip, strip, which would have been good advice had the fish been coming towards me, but he was running. In a moment of confusion, all I did was put my finger on the line and cork, and you can guess what happened. Bye-bye, beast of a trout. I was depressed that evening, which was stupid because I had such a great day. I looked at the beautiful Val Atkinson photographs on the wall of my cabin and resolved to fish at the boat ramp for poops and giggles on the way home. Fall River is not a place to wade or shore fish for many reasons. Val told me a different place to go, so I went there. While catching some little rising trout at this spot the next morning and feeling great, a car pulled up and a young man got out. I thought he's probably a local that wants to fish here, so I'll just head home. He asked me politely if he could hang out. I said sure and immediately got the vibe. This guy is a guide. He asked me what I was using. I showed him the fly, a Mercer's missing link, and he asked to look in my fly box. He picked out another but darker Mercer's missing link. I tied it on, and then he said, come over here by me and start feeding your line downstream as fast as you can. There are big fish feeding out there, and this is pretty amazing. I could barely see my fly. It was so far away, and there were so many rises around it that it was tough to tell if it was my fly they were munching. But I saw one big splash and instinctively set the hook. The nice young man said, we are landing this fish, and helped me by getting down in the water and netting a beautiful fat rainbow that barely fit in the net. It was amazing. Not just the fish, but the kindness that young man showed me. I'll never forget that. Wow. Dave, this is an awesome story. That sounds awesome. Sounds like a wonderful day on the water. And those cool moments when people stop to help out like that, it's really fun. And that's one of the cooler things about fly fishing is you do get to run into those people in those moments, I think more often than in other outdoor pursuits. In my experience, it's a really cool thing, but I love this whole story, man. Congrats on the great day that you had. Thanks for sending this story in. I really appreciate it. And with that, folks, we're going to wrap up this week's show. Thank you so much for being here with us this week. I appreciate it so much. And if you haven't already, if you could please rate or subscribe to the show wherever you're listening to it, that will help us out a ton. The more ratings and subscriptions we get, the more folks get to hear the good word of VFC, the more people we can help live real life and have a great time out on the water. As always, if you've got a question you'd like answered or a live real life moment you want to share with us, there are links to submit both of those in the show notes. And until next week, everybody, get out on the water, have a great time, and live real life.